So, what is personality? If you think about your own personality, it might be kind of difficult to describe the characteristics that make you who you are. Sometimes it's easier to think about a friend's personality. But in psychology, personality refers to the individual differences and patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that are characteristic of an individual. So when psychologists study personality, they really focus on two major areas. One is the understanding of individual differences in particular personality characteristics, like how outgoing someone is, or maybe how introverted they are. Or the other is understanding how different parts of a person come together to create their whole personality. So when we talk about personality, this is where in this class we really start talking about Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud is probably the most famous psychologist and sometimes referred to as the founding father of psychology. Freud was born in 1856 in Moravia, which is now in the Czech Republic. Later in life, he lived in London. You can visit Freud's house in London if you ever have the opportunity to travel there. Freud went to school actually for medicine. So he, even though he's like the most famous psychologist, technically he was a neurologist. He went to medical school and then developed psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, what we call psychodynamic psychology, and he was responsible for really changing the way that we look at psychological disorders, and he trained a number of other psychologists, a few of which we will talk about today. In future psychology classes, you'll learn more about Freud, but today we're just going to learn some basic concepts. One is of his theory of the personality. How is the personality structured? And he identified three personality structures: the id, the ego, and the superego. So Freud would say that your personality is composed of these three different elements. The id, the first one over here that says I want it now, is the only element that's present at birth. And the id is driven by what we call the pleasure principle. And so with the id, this is the part of your personality that's totally driven by the unconscious and includes instinctive or primitive drives or behaviors. So again, the id is driven by the pleasure principle, and the pleasure principle is about instant gratification or immediate gratification of desires, wants, wishes, etc. So if these are not fulfilled immediately, it causes tension or anxiety. So if you really want a chocolate bar, you just eat the chocolate bar. And if you think about this, early in life, that's very important for an infant because it ensures their survival. Because if an infant is hungry, they will just eat. The ego over here, I need to do a bit of planning to get it, is very different from the id. So the ego is the part of your personality that's responsible for dealing with reality, and it is driven by the reality principle. So according to Freud, the ego develops later in life, and it develops from the id, and it's there to make sure that the impulses of the id can be expressed in a way that is appropriate to the real world. Like if you want that chocolate bar, and you're at the grocery store, do you just grab the package, open it, and eat it? No, you have to go about it in a realistic way. Well, I mean, some folks might, but if somebody was just eating chocolate bars in the middle of the grocery store, Freud would say, their id is driving their behavior. They haven't had the development of the ego. And sometimes that word ego, we use it to mean like somebody that has like over-exaggerated self-esteem. Like we say, oh, that person has a big ego. In Freudian psychology, you need to think about it in a different way. So the ego is not just unconscious. It is also conscious and preconscious, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And again, the ego is driven by the reality principle, which is trying to satisfy the id desires, but in a realistic and appropriate way. So the reality principle would weigh like costs and benefits of an action before just recklessly engaging in the behavior or action like the id would, and is capable of delayed gratification. Again, unlike the id that would be working on instant gratification. Now, the last one, the superego over here, you can't have it. It's not right. Well, think about that with a chocolate bar in the grocery store. Do you ever have a desire to eat candy and something kicks in and you say, no, I shouldn't have that? Well, that would be what Freud conceptualized as the superego. And that's the last component of personality to develop. It takes a little while. And the superego is driven by the morality principle. So you have to learn moral standards that then become internalized. And we get these from our parents, society, at school, at church. Lots of different things teach us morality or our sense of right and wrong. And the superego gives us the guidelines that we need to make appropriate judgments, again, based on that morality principle. So Freud says that the superego doesn't even show up until you're around 5 years old, but then it has a process of developing. And then Freud says that there has to be an interaction between the id, ego, and the superego. So if you think about that, could the id get out of control? I bet you know some people like that. And on the other hand, could the superego become overexpressed? Sure, I bet you know folks like that. Freud used this term called ego strength to refer to the ego's ability to function between these two dueling forces. So if you had a good, strong ego, you had nice balance between the id and the superego. So again, id, pleasure principle, ego, reality principle, superego, morality principle. And Freud often talks about structures of the personality being unconscious. And that's like out of your conscious awareness. So he said that your personality is like an iceberg, and that 90% of it is underwater and out of your conscious awareness. And only your ego and your superego are in your conscious awareness. And then there's a area of awareness called preconscious that you're slightly aware of. But you can see here that the id is totally an unconscious process. Now, Freud identified 3 types of anxiety. And, Freudian theory is, a lot of it is focused on anxiety. The first one is neurotic anxiety, and this is an unconscious worry that we're going to lose control of id urges, resulting in punishment for inappropriate behavior. The next one is reality anxiety, and this is the real world events and the fear of those. The cause of this anxiety is usually easily identified. So if someone is afraid of being bit by a dog when they're near a dog, well, that's realistic, especially if it's a menacing dog. So this is the most common way of reducing the anxiety, is to avoid the threatening object. And then moral anxiety involves a fear of violating our own moral principles. Freud says that we use defense mechanisms. And defense mechanisms are coping techniques that reduce anxiety that arises from unacceptable or potentially harmful impulses from the id. So, what are some defense mechanisms? Well, they're really common, and as we go through these, I'll bet you'll recognize some of this behavior in yourself or other people. The first one's with identification with the aggressor. And here is a focus on negative or feared traits. If you're afraid of someone, you can conquer that fear by becoming more like them. So maybe a little kid is bullied by a bigger kid, and they're scared of that bully, and to deal with that anxiety, they develop some of the traits of the bully and then become bullies themselves. An extreme example of this is Stockholm Syndrome. You may have heard of that. That's when a hostage begins to identify with their captor or the terrorists that took them hostage. But sometimes you'll see that in the media. Another one is repression. This is the first defense mechanism that Freud discovered, and maybe the most important. Repression is an unconscious mechanism that the ego employs to keep disturbing or threatening content that kind of bubbles up from the id. It just keeps it from becoming conscious at all. Reaction formation is a really interesting defense mechanism. And yeah, frankly, I see this one all the time in people. A lot of times you see this in people that have a very public personality. Like a good example would be politicians or something like that. And what reaction formation is, this is where a person goes beyond denial and behaves in the opposite way in which he or she actually thinks or feels. And if you use the reaction formation, the id is sort of satisfied while keeping the ego in ignorance of the true motives. So conscious feelings are the opposite of what the unconscious actually feels. So if you feel love, then in public you would hate that person. If you feel shame in your behavior, then you might see disgust. And moralizing are reaction formation against sexuality. So, like, I'm trying to think of an example of this. A good one would be Jerry Sandusky. I don't know if that name sounds familiar, but he was a coach at Penn State University, and he was very well known. He was very successful, and he ran charities to help children out. At the same time, he was molesting children. So how can a person that's like a pedophile that is sexually abusing children, in person they're acting as if they really, really care about children? That's not the best example of reaction formation, but it kind of gives you that idea of how people kind of act the opposite of how they actually feel inside. Displacement is an interesting one. This is where you have a redirection of an impulse. Usually it's aggressive onto a substitute target. A lot of Freud's impulses are like sexual and aggressive. So like if you got mad at work and wanted to yell at your boss, most folks know that they can't do that. So if they have that impulse to yell at their boss, but you can't do that. So who would you direct that to? And you have to displace that from someone that is too threatening to somebody that can serve as a symbolic substitute. So you might come home and yell at your wife or yell at your kids or dog or something like that. Projection, this one's very interesting. This involves individuals attributing their own thoughts, feelings, and motives to another person. So thoughts are most commonly projected onto another are ones that would cause guilt, such as aggressive or sexual fantasies or something like that. So the example I use of this is like if you've ever been to a party and one of your friends is like, maybe you have a guy friend and he's like, look at that girl over there. She wants me. She's so into me. But it appears as if the girl is not paying any sort of attention to the guy at all. Well, he's probably projecting his own desires. He's seeing them being projected back. Denial is the blocking of external events from awareness. If someone is in just a situation that's just way too much to handle, the person might refuse to experience it. I've had denial happen to me a handful of times. I think a powerful example is learning that like a loved one has died unexpectedly. I can remember instances where I've received those phone calls and it's like somebody will tell me what has happened and it's like it doesn't even register, and it might take a while for, well, in that circumstance it took a little while for me to even like understand the information, and denial was probably at work somewhere. Sublimation, this is kind of similar to displacement, but it takes place when we manage to displace our emotions into a constructive rather than destructive activity. So sublimation, Freud would say this is like the only healthy defense mechanism. So I want you to think about that. If you are like a really aggressive person and you have those aggressive urges, how can you sublimate them in a way that's healthy? What would you think somebody would do if they were really aggressive? Well, maybe they become a boxer or a surgeon, maybe something like that. So sublimation is a healthy one. Now regression, you're not going to understand this quite yet, but we got to go to the next thing for you to get this. This is movement back in time to a psychological state when we're faced with stress, a psychological state where we feel comfortable. So if we're troubled or frightened, our behaviors might become more childish or primitive. A child might begin to suck their thumb again or wet the bed when they need to spend some time in the hospital. Or, like in my case as a professor, a lot of students, if they're confronted with something that they don't want to do, like a final exam, they'll start whining like a little kid. And there's a kind of a joke there for you, a little Pink Freud. The regression is based on the psychosexual stages. So we're kind of out of development, but this is not out of development. We're out of the structure of the personality into stages of development. So Freud said that we have several stages of development. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but the stages progress based on age. So so this is one part of Freud's theory that often makes people uncomfortable, and historically, I mean, if you think about the time in which Freud was a contemporary, this made people extremely uncomfortable, because what he's talking about is like a sexual drive theory. So how do human beings from birth to adulthood, how do they progress through those psychosexual stages? And if you've ever heard the term libido, that is the term that Freud uses for sexual energy. And it's weird to think of this, but Freud said that even as a little kid, you had sexual energy or libido, but it's not like the sexual energy that an adult would have. So I want you to think about this more as, don't use the word sexual, think of it as like what feels good. And so for little kids, the first stage is the oral stage. So this is an infant, and where do they achieve gratification? Well, through like oral activities like feeding, thumb sucking, babbling, stuff like that. That's important for an infant. That's how they're going to stay alive. The next stage is the anal stage, and this is where the child learns potty training. So they learn both bowel and bladder control, and these are response to demands of society that kids have to do that. The next stage is the phallic stage. Like, I don't know if you've ever heard that term, but like a phallic symbol would be something that's symbolic of like a sexual organ. So here the child learns to realize the difference between males and females and becomes aware of sexuality. And then the latency period, Freud says that here the child continues his or her development, but sexual urges are relatively quiet, so they go away, they're latent. And then once you hit puberty, this is where an adolescent shakes off old dependencies and learns to deal maturely with the opposite sex. And that's where regular adult like sexual energy would be present from that age on. So Freud is kind of an interesting character, and you know, you could spend semesters studying Freud, and you know, a lot of his ideas have been rejected. Some are it's very difficult to prove a lot of Freud's theories through research. He is quite a controversial character. You know, he really had a focus on sex and aggression. His personal behaviors were sometimes questionable. You know, there's stories of him using and prescribing cocaine to his patients. At that time, cocaine would have been a pharmaceutical drug. He was kind of misogynistic. He was a controversial character. So this is kind of a quote that's kind of funny if you think about some of Freud's ideas. And Freud habitually smoked cigars. So he was constantly smoking cigars. And if you go back to that last slide, the oral stage, if Freud was to regress back to a stage, like using his own theories of defense mechanisms, you might say that Freud has an oral fixation, and that's what his cigar smoking was about. Somebody confronted him about that, and this was a quote that he said, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar." So I guess Freudian theory applies to everyone except for Freud. So I'd encourage you to learn more about Freud if you're interested in him, and you'll encounter his work throughout your psychology classes. Okay, the next figure is Carl Jung. Carl Jung was born in 1875 in Switzerland. Of note, we didn't really talk about this with Freud, but a lot of the early psychologists are Jewish, and Jung is not. So he kind of stands out from the other early psychologists on that, but his background is very interesting. He is not just he's goes to medical school, much like Freud, but he's also very interested in philosophy, anthropology, archaeology, literature, religious studies, lots and lots of areas of interest. he studied with Freud, but he eventually had a split with Freud. So Freud sets up a group of psychologists that work together in Vienna. But prior to that, the story is that Carl Jung met with Freud in Vienna in 1906, and the story is that the first time that they met in person, that they talked nonstop for 13 hours straight. And after that, then he and Freud have a strong bond, and Jung kind of goes to study with Freud. But then there is a break, and Jung breaks off from Freud. And the major reason is that Jung said that Freud was far too focused on sexual development, and it was all about sex. And he did think that, like, the libido was important, but he didn't think that the libido alone was responsible for the formation of a person's, like, core sense of personality. So he breaks off and creates his own theory. It's still kind of based on Freud's theory, but Freud has a break with a number of psychologists, and they are then called the Neo-Freudians, or the New Freudians. And again, in this class, we're just going to cover some of the very, very basics, and you'll learn about Carl Jung in other classes. But some of the ideas that Carl had were, one, that we had a personal unconscious, and that's a part of the unconscious that is akin to Freud's concept, but it is a reservoir of all our repressed thoughts and feelings. And then he said that we had a collective unconscious, which is like a universal memory bank that contains all the ancestral memories, images, symbols, and ideas that have been accumulated throughout their involvement. So it's kind of like a historical memory that's passed down like genetically from your ancestors. And then Jung had the concept of archetypes. Archetypes were powerful, emotionally charged universal images or concepts that he had in his theory of the collective unconscious. So within the collective unconscious, you could identify these archetypal symbols. So, for example, if you looked at different, like mythology throughout the world in different cultures, you would see like very specific patterns of characters that Jung would say are archetypes. So, like, for example, he has a number of these, but like one would be the creator, and that, like, the core thing there is that the creator would create something of value, or the jester, and the jester would live life in the moment with joy and excitement, or the outlaw, whose focus is on revenge or revolution. And what Jung said is that if you look at culture and mythology, you see these archetypal characters show up again and again and again. So he had a theory of, like, the unconscious and the conscience, much like Freud, but he says that the self is unconscious. And then he has a theory of the anima and the animus. so this is kind of odd, but he said that in your unconscious, if you're a man, that you have some feminine inner qualities to your personality, and that would be the anima. And then in contrast, in the unconscious of a woman would be expressed masculine personality, and that is the animus. Now the shadow or shadow aspect is part of your unconscious personality that the ego is not going to identify with. And this is the least desirable characteristics of your own personality, like negative stuff, like the bad things, the bad parts of your personality that you might not want to be aware of. Jung said that, like, the quote is that everyone carries a shadow, and that it is that Jung said the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. So if you're more aware of it, that's probably a better thing for you. But if you keep it in the unconscious, that can get out of control. And then the ego is like the self. It's kind of similar to Freud's concept of the ego. And then the persona is different. The persona is, this is like the mask that you wear in public, or the social face that you present to the world. And it's there to make a specific impact or impression on other people. And Jung said that if you had a strong ego, that you would have a flexible persona. Like in different situations, you know that you have to put on like a different mask. It's not like you're just one thing and that's the only, like, I don't know, presentation that you have in public. You have to be flexible. Alright, now we're on to Alfred Adler. So Adler is another, again, a medical doctor, but he becomes interested in psychology, and he studies with Freud, and he also studies with Jung, so he and Jung were about the same age. Alfred Adler was born in 1870 near Vienna in Austria, and he was Jewish. And again, he was a medical doctor, but he then studied psychology with Freud, and then eventually he becomes a founder of the school of individual psychology. And so if we look at Adler's background, it's kind of interesting how this impacts his theories of personality versus Freud's. And again, he splits off with Freud just like Jung did. So when Adler was a young child, he developed Rickets. And Rickets is a disease that's a disease of the bones and the legs that's caused by typically a vitamin D deficiency. But he was stricken with this in childhood. And if we think about how Adler splits from Freud, he thinks that Freud is mistaken in centering his theory on the concept of repressed sexual and aggression conflicts, again similar to Jung, but then he comes up with this idea, and I think a lot of it is based on his childhood. So when he was sick with Rickets, he had to wear leg braces. He wasn't you know, he couldn't interact with the other children. It kept him from walking until he was like 4 years old. And in addition to that, he was a sickly kid. I mean, he was sick all the time. And there's a story that when he was 4, he had pneumonia, and he was really, really sick. And back then, the doctors would come to your house, like for a house call, and he heard a doctor say to his dad, your boy is lost. And like meaning that he was going to die. And Adler says at that point, that's when he decided to become a physician. So he's got this childhood where he has a lot of limitations. But then, as he gets older, he kind of overcomes these limitations that he has. And just as a side note, his older brother was named Sigmund, which is kind of interesting given his later relationship with Sigmund Freud, and he was very competitive with him. So, so despite his limitations, Adler goes to medical school, and then after graduation, he sets up his own like office, his medical office in Vienna, near the Prater. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but that is like an amusement park that was in Vienna. And so he had a lot of patients that worked there. And they were things like acrobats that worked there, or artists. And a lot of them, their livelihood was dependent on like their bodily skills. And then they would come to see Adler as a doctor, and a lot of them had a lot of physical weaknesses, not too dissimilar from Adler as a child. And this led him to develop this theory that people overcompensate for their perceived deficiencies like they would have in childhood. So, you know, I don't know, maybe it wouldn't be too far of a stretch to say that Adler would, you know, he can't walk as a child. He's in those braces. He then, as an adult, becomes very athletic. If he was able to do that. And so he developed this idea of the single most important driving force in shaping human personality is striving for perfection or superiority. So we've got these areas of weakness, and we have a drive to become perfect or superior. And this is striving for superiority, and Adler's Neo-Freudian theory is this universal urge that we have to achieve self-protection through successful adaptations to life circumstances, mastering challenges, and personal growth. But he said that sometimes people get stuck, and that they might get stuck in thinking about their weaknesses or where they are inferior. And that's what Adler identified as an inferiority complex, which you probably heard, or a superiority complex, that they're too focused on developing superiority. So we have the striving, but we don't want to have a complex. Really quickly, I like to kind of talk about Abraham Maslow, because a lot of people have encountered his work in like high school or something like that, because he's best known for something called the hierarchy of needs. So Maslow is an American psychologist. He was born in 1908, and he created this idea of a hierarchy of needs. So this is a psychological theory that your psychological health depends on fulfilling some priorities. So if you look at the hierarchy that Maslow created, he said that in order to achieve self-actualization, which is the desire to realize your full potential, like to become the person that you can become, is to reach the level of self-actualization, that you have to have these other needs met first, beginning down here: physiological, then safety, love and belonging, esteem, and then you can reach self-actualization. Honestly, I don't really believe in this. I think that a lot of people, when they're lacking in some of these areas, are able to reach really amazing levels of self-actualization, and that you don't necessarily need that. But it's just kind of an interesting, different way to think about personality that's different from the Freudians. So again, this is just a basic introduction to the idea of personality psychology. If you're interested in this area, there is far more studying to do, and you can take a whole college class in personality psychology if you so desire. And I would encourage you to do so. That's it for this one. As always, email me if you have any questions.